All right, we're going to do some factoring. And before we get into the actual factoring, these are pre-steps, things you have to do for every problem before you start factoring. 1, make sure the terms are in descending order with respect to one of the variables. So that means the exponents are going to go from biggest to smallest. 2, make sure your lead coefficient is positive. So once you put the terms in descending order, you want the coefficient of the first term to be a positive number. Let's first begin with how to factor with 4 terms. With any factoring, the first step is always to factor out the greatest common factor. So for example, let's say we had this problem. Each of these terms we could divide by 4. So I'm going to put an equal sign. I'm going to factor out a 4 to the front, and then I'm going to put in the grouping symbols what's left after I divide each term by 4. It's going to be the first step if there's 4 terms, to factor out the greatest common factor. Second step, if you have 4 terms, is to factor by grouping. Let me explain how this works. Say that we have this problem. Our pre-steps that we mentioned earlier is to write the terms in descending order with respect to the exponents. So it would be negative 10x cubed plus 20x squared minus 6x plus 12. Second pre-step is to make sure that the leading coefficient is positive. Right now it's negative. In addition to that, I'm also going to factor out the greatest common factor. So I'm going to factor out a negative 2. What I'm left with is 5x cubed minus 10x squared plus 3x minus 6. Once the greatest common factor is factored out, it's negative 2. Once my leading coefficient is positive, then I factor by grouping. Here's how that works. You're going to group terms together that have common factors. For example, 5x cubed minus 10x squared, those have common factors, and 3x and 6 have common factors. So to group them, you put them in parentheses. It's extremely important that you have this plus sign between those sets of parentheses. Then you find the greatest common factor of each group. Of this first group here, the GCF is going to be 5x squared. I write that out in front. And then I leave in parentheses what's remaining, which is going to be an x minus 2. To determine what's remaining, you take each of these terms and divide them by the greatest common factor. If I find the GCF of the second group, make sure I bring that plus sign down. It is 3, leaving me with x minus 2. Then, to complete the factor by grouping, each time bringing down the minus 2, I look at 2 terms. I get this is one term, this is all one term. The factors in this first term are 5, x squared, and x minus 2. The factors in the second term are 3 and an x minus 2. So I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor with those terms. The greatest common factor is an x minus 2. What's remaining is a 5x squared plus a 3. So I'm going to have the remaining factors in another set of parentheses, and at this point it is fully factored. A factor is something that you're multiplying. So we have negative 2 times x minus 2 times 5x squared plus 3. This is fully factored. This problem is finished. If you flip your page over to the back, it's page 2, I'm going to show you how to do 2 more problems factoring by grouping. So number 1, I have this equation here, and it's breaking a couple of my pre-steps. I want to make sure that my terms are in descending order. So I'm going to have equals negative x squared, scratch that. I'm going to have x cubed minus x squared plus 2x minus 2. The exponents are in descending order, 3, 2, 1, and then 0. Leading coefficient is positive, so I can continue to factor by grouping. I'm going to group together the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. Now keep in mind I would also want to, before I did that, factor out the greatest common factor, but the GCF is 1, so I don't need to do that. My first group The GCF is x squared. If I factor that out, I'm left with x minus 1. In my second group, my GCF is 2. If I factor that out, I'm left with x minus 1. At this point, I have two terms. This is my first term, this is my second term. Each of those terms both have a common factor of x minus 1. So the GCF of this is x minus 1. I write that in front, bring the equal sign down each time. If I factor out an x minus 1 from this first term, I'm left with an x squared. If I factor out an x minus 1 from the second term, I'm left with a plus 2. This is fully factored, and that problem is finished. If I go down to the next problem, this problem is a mess because there's so many variables. When you have all different kinds of variables like this, I wouldn't be concerned about putting the terms in descending order with respect to one of the variables. If you only had two variables, maybe. But here we got three different variables, so I wouldn't worry about it. I would want my first coefficient to be positive, though. So I'm going to factor a negative 1 out of this. Technically, you wouldn't have to do that, but I think it's going to make the problem easier if we do it. Anything we can do to make the problem easier, we want to do it. Then I group terms together. And I also probably, when I do this GCF, I want to use brackets instead of parentheses, because I'm going to have parentheses inside of my parentheses. It's easier to read if I have brackets. So I'll bring the negative 1 down, bring my brackets down. When I group terms together, it's extremely important that when I do so, I have a plus sign between my groups. Plus. So this, where it did say subtract, 24rxy, I'm going to make a plus sign here and change that from a subtract to a negative 24rxy. Right, not space there. Find the GCF of each group. This first group has a GCF of 24x squared. So I write that in front of the brackets, or the parentheses, and I'm left with 8y plus 3x. And I know I'm left with that because if I put into a calculator 192 divided by 24, I get 8 left. X squared, all that goes into the front. I'm left with a y. That's why there's a y here. If I divide 72 by 24, I get 3. X cubed divided by x squared is x. And then this next one, the GCF, is a negative 3rx. So I have plus a negative 3rx, and I'm left with 8y plus 3x. Once again, what's in this parentheses is the same as this parentheses. I'm just noticing something that I could have done at the beginning that I'm going to end up doing here. My fault. GCF now is 8x plus 3. Pardon me, 8y plus 3x. And I could be using all parentheses now. I don't have to use brackets. And what's left is 24x squared plus a negative 3rx. Might be good that I made this mistake, because I can show you how to fix it. The mistake I made at the beginning is I didn't factor out the greatest common factor. Each of these terms has an x in it. So I could have factored that out. I forgot to do it. So it's not a tragedy, because at this point I can still factor out any common factor. For example, this binomial, there's no common factors. It's finished. This one, there is a common factor. There's a common factor of a 3 and an x. So I could have pulled a 3 and an x out of here at the beginning. I didn't. Should have. If I pull a 3x out of that, it's going to be a negative 3x out front, and then an 8y plus 3x. And if I divide each of these terms by 3x, I'm going to get 8x minus 3r. And that's not entirely correct, because if I factored out a 3 out of this shouldn't be a 3. So let me try to fix this, which I can't erase it. It should be a 1r, which means that's just an r. There, it's fixed. So your assignment here is to do the factoring by grouping worksheet, which there are 20 problems. Thank you very much, and have an awesome day.